Welcome to episode 2 of Exploring Grief. This is the second episode of a 4-episode series. I am your guest host, Brandon Carleton. I am an author, pastor, podcaster, and I am the temporary host for this 4-part series of the Catching Your Breath podcast, which is usually hosted by the beautiful and full of Southern charm, Steve Austin. If you haven't listened to episode 1 of this series, I encourage you to go back and listen. It kind of sets up the series in general, but it also helps you fully experience this episode and the coming episodes as well. In this episode, we sit down with Sarah Stevens. Sarah is the founder of the Beautifull Project. That is beautiful with 2 L's. I'll have the link in the description. But the Beautifull Project is a storytelling collective. It's a blog, a podcast. It's many things. But in the latest season of the podcast, which is called, the name of the podcast is Beauty, the Interviews. And again, like I said, I'll have the link in the description. But in the second season of the podcast, she interviewed trauma survivors. And I've been hammering this point. I did throughout the first episode, and we will in the interview, and we will in coming episodes. This is important to understand. Grief is not just about the loss of a loved one. So Sarah and I talk about grieving different kinds of losses, and we talk about what she has learned through sitting down with these trauma survivors. But that's not all that Sarah is. Sarah is also one of my closest friends. Sarah and her wife have taught me and my wife so much about love. They've probably taught us more about love in the last 3 years than I've known or learned, in the first 27 years of my life. And you know what? They've helped me unlearn a lot of bad things about love as well. So needless to say, I'm very excited for you guys to meet Sarah. As always, when I talk with Sarah, we ended up talking for a very long while. So this interview is an edited interview. You can listen to the interview in full on Steve Austin's Patreon. We recorded a longer introduction, but for time's sake, we edited down this interview. So where we jump into the interview is Sarah explaining her podcast, which again will be linked in the description. So on to the interview. Before we jump in, I'm going to give this disclaimer in every episode. I think it's very important to say that I am not a doctor. I am not here to heal you. I'm not here to diagnose you. And really, if you feel like you need it, and even if you maybe don't feel like you need it, I cannot recommend enough going to see a grief counselor or a therapist. Go see a professional. Again, I am not a doctor. I am simply here to explore this topic with you as a fellow traveler of life that is carrying with me grief. So I am not a doctor. Let's go to the interview.
So season 1 was sort of more broad. I opened up with a question about, tell me the first time you realized your body was different from other bodies. And then each interview took its own path from there. What happened is that I realized that there was a theme on repeat in this first season. And almost every single woman I sat with had survived something in her body.
Wow.
And so I determined that the second season would be the season of survivors. Very intentional selection of people to sit down across the microphone, people who had survived something in their bodies. And it wasn't always the same thing. I actually worked really hard to sort of curate a broad range of topics. So it's women who've survived sexual assault and domestic violence and miscarriage and infertility. I'm trying to think of some others. That's kind of those are the broad categories. But I invite women to the microphone to talk to me about what it means to be a survivor, about their story of survival, and then I invite them to talk about the healing, because we turn the corner a little bit. And sometimes the reality is that the healing hasn't happened yet, you know, and it's also really powerful to just hold space for that.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the mystery of making space. that, like I said, even if you never recorded or that conversation that you had with all these women, if just the fact that you set an intentional time, me and you are going to sit down in this room and talk about it, there's something that, like, there's some sort of magic in that.
Yeah.
What do you think is happening there?
Gosh. This is still, I'm not sure how articulate I'll be about this, but I'll try.
Yeah.
Because it is, you said it, it's a mystery to me. It's still a mystery to me the way that people will respond to all that I'm really doing. And this is probably not something that needs to be minimized. We probably should make a big deal out of it because I don't think we do a lot of this. All that I'm really doing is locking eyes with somebody and saying, you matter, like everything about it. And you get to be messy, and you don't have to have all the words together. I can't tell you how many people sit across from me and they always open up this conversation by saying, like, I'm so nervous. I don't know if I'm going to have the right words, and these are people who have survived things that I cannot imagine walking through. And they're nervous about whether or not their words will be right across them, in a microphone. And my job is to help them forget that there's a microphone there at all, right? It's just a conversation between the two of us. But I really think the mystery of holding space for somebody is about really seeing all of another person.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to explain how you do that, other than just slow down for a second.
Yeah. When you were saying that, I think what it is in that very specific context is that because we're so bad at grieving, personally, it means we're bad at helping other people grieve. We're afraid of it. So when other people are going through something, we don't tend to hold space for them. And so quite possibly when they sit down in that room with you, it's the first time that someone sat down with them and said, I'm here, let's talk.
Yeah, tell it to me.
I'm present with you.
Yeah.
This is a safe space.
Yeah.
And I want your story deserves to be heard. Your voice matters, and let's talk about it. And that's kind of makes me sad that it's very possible it's the first time someone's done that to them.
It very often is. I'll often hear people say, I've never been asked to tell it from beginning to end, and that is another powerful experience, I'm certain of it, particularly because, unfortunately, most women I'm talking to have survived serial trauma. We're not talking about isolated incidents, which is awful.
Yeah.
I had one woman, this extraordinary human being, who has a tattoo that's a lotus, and she made the phrase "Life of the Unstoppable Survivor" for the lotus, for the acronym.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This woman survived a brutal sexual assault, and then she ended up with a ton of physical trauma that has been with her entire life, neurological, physical trauma from this experience that will be with her for the rest of her life, right? So, and then she also was in a domestically abusive relationship. She lost a baby to miscarriage. This was serial trauma.
Yeah.
And I'm watching her, and I'm watching her find this resilience in herself, But she had said to me at the beginning, she goes, I've never told this whole story from beginning to end, not one time.
Man.
Yeah. And I think there's this thing, and I actually have my own story is it's got some serial trauma to it. The other thing that'll happen, I think, for survivors is that there's this internalized thing you do that you go, this almost sounds ridiculous. Nobody will believe me if there's this much crazy that happened to one person, you know? So that's just another example of how we sort of shrink our own existence to go, I don't want to be seen. We crave being seen, and we're terrified of being seen at the same time,
Yeah.
So it's awesome to get them in a room and go, we just have an hour. And I always remind them, too, that we don't have to publish anything. Because ultimately, this is not about me driving a following or downloads or all of those things are great, and I want people to follow. But that is not why. I am doing the work that I'm doing because I think people heal when they're heard.
That's beautiful. I like that phrase a lot.
It just came to me, so let's just use that.
That should be your,
I think I'm going to use that new tagline. Everybody.
that should be your new tagline for sure. Yeah, that, man, so many different directions I want to go. One thing I was thinking of is that, like, I know what you mean about that. Now if something, like, I think that, I'm going to speculate, but to draw a parallel, that woman who sat down, or any woman who sat down and talked to you and had some sort of sexual trauma or sexual abuse type thing happen to them, every woman they talk to, they are now watching how they talk, what words they say, how they hold their bodies.
Yep.
They're now sensitive to people are trying to, other women are maybe trying to hide that or are ashamed of that, their own trauma. I think it's the exact same thing. If you have your antenna up, so to speak, for people that need space to grieve, you're going to need to do what you did and create some boundaries. You're not going to be short of people that want to share their trauma and their grief with you. You said something about the way that grief works and how that it's not linear and it's a spiral. But you had said something about when people share it, they thought they were over it.
Yeah.
And then they realized they weren't.
Yeah.
So maybe talk a little bit about how grief, the grieving process is kind of, how it's not so cut and dry.
Well, I think a few things about that. The first is I think we're a little bit wired to want to know the beginning and the end of something.
Yes, yeah.
So we do tend as humans to be avoidant of a process that doesn't have a clear cut, this is when it starts and this is when it's over. And so I think what we do when we grieve something that we've lost is that we impose then what we think the structure should be. And I hear this in these women often, like you just shared. I can't think of a single interview who didn't come back and say, I've been a little messed up since we talked, and they see it that way of like, oh God, I just unearthed all of that and I thought I was done and I'm not done. Now, the good news about the people who are sitting across the microphone from me, I do have sort of one really loose rule. And I never know it going in because I don't prep these interviews. I actually think I would damage the integrity of the interview if I prepped them.
Sure.
They know the 3 questions I'll ask them. They'll know that we'll explore in between because the authenticity is really important. I need to hear it for the first time because that'll prompt my questions. And it also is a trigger for me to stay really present. If I know what's coming next, I am more likely to be thinking about my next question. Well, I can't do that when I'm hearing your story for the first time.
Yeah.
So the only real rule I have is that in the process of talking to these people, before I'm willing to publish it, I have to have heard something in the interview about how they have resources or have developed resources so that they don't end up in more pain. I don't need to re-traumatize survivors.
Right.
Right?
Wow, yeah.
That is not my job. And so I'm very cautious of that. I'm also very cautious of how much detail I ask them to share because that's really triggering for survivors, particularly survivors of sexual abuse. So for all of these people who get published, I know I have some relative confidence that they have the resources available to them to help with what's going to happen next. Because that's part of why I think we're avoidant about talking about our trauma and our suffering, is because we do have a sense of there's something about our words calling it back into the present moment, right? That we have to then have some skill to go, it's not still happening.
Yeah, you're kind of, it's so, especially in those cases, it was so traumatic that it's, you talking about it is you're feeling it all over again. You're
Totally.
reliving it, yeah.
And so I think that is a little bit shocking to them that they'll say, wow, it feels fresh again. However, when that happens, which it often does, I'm always conscious of checking back in with them after a few more weeks. And inevitably they'll say, yeah, it was hard, but I actually needed to go back through it again. Like there were parts that this was good, basically. So what that's shown me is sort of what I suppose I know from my own life too, that grief really does seem to move in like a spiral that gets closer to the center every trip you take around,
Wow.
right? Because I have to, we formulate certain things internally in response to the things that have caused us suffering, right? So whether they are defense mechanisms or protective measures or whatever, if we're going to unlayer those things, we don't pull that off all at one time. So it's often, I often talk about how we are who we are underneath layers, and that has to come off incrementally, and that's not any different here with grieving. I like the spiral visual a little bit better than the layering thing.
Well, yeah, like at it's the rings of that spiral as they go down. It's healing that's happening.
Totally.
So you're not ready on day one to be healed all the way.
Nope.
You got to heal a little bit, and then when you're ready, a little bit. But as you do that, you get further down, metaphorically speaking.
Yes.
Like you get to the deeper parts of where that trauma is in your body, and then you also are getting closer and closer to the root cause of, like the main initial. I don't know what you want to call it, like impact point of that trauma.
And I think what's important for people to realize about that process is that it may feel more intense as you get closer to the core. Think about any wound. If you pull the top scab off of something, depending on how deep the wound is, the top layer is not really that painful. It's itchy, right? But the closer you get to the core of that thing, it opens up the actual rawness of it. I just had this experience yesterday myself. I was in therapy, and I thought I'm going to say the same thing all of the people who sit with me say. I thought I was over. We were talking about a particular part of the end of my first marriage. I would have told you I was not in pain about that at all anymore. I don't feel pain about that most of the time. She asked me one question that actually part of what happened is it almost took me back to that place. I could still feel it all of a sudden, right? And then I realized that I was still in a tremendous amount of pain. Now, the good news about that experience is that pain really does move through me when I let it, right? So it wasn't like I don't still feel in pain today. I feel actually like I released another little part of this thing that I had buried so deep I couldn't even find it. So I feel lighter on the other side of that. And so those are the things that we're unearthing in those spirals, the things that we grabbed just a little bit of a story and we buried it underneath there. And we do that. Part of the healing definitely is release of that. So definitely it's not linear, and it's the reason why people say over and over and over, I thought I was over this, or worse yet, I should be over this. That kills me when I hear that.
Yeah.
I should be over this. I don't do that to myself anymore. I realize most of the time, sometimes I'm surprised that I'm not, but I'm rarely critical of it anymore. When I am still in pain about something, I really use it as sort of a reflection of like, wow, I've got great denial skills. I'm really great at going, I'm not in pain. I'm so good at that.
Yeah.
And as I pay closer attention, particularly to my body, I am far more attuned today to how much pain I've kind of just like grabbed and shoved somewhere in here. Because I can feel it now.
Yes, yeah. I have been doing this meditation where there's like 4 prompts, and one of them is now release any anger that you hold or you're holding on to. And the first time that I did it, I kind of laughed because, you know me. Have you ever seen me be angry?
Nope. This is why I'm always telling you that yes, yes, I do not see you get angry.
Right.
But I know now I've known you well enough to know sometimes I can feel your unexpressed anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's talk about mystery. That's something that you probably feel it even when we're not together. But yeah. Which is wild. But so the first time I did it, I kind of laughed. I was like, oh, haha, anger that I'm holding on to. And then I don't know why, next time I did it a couple times after, I was like, maybe I am. I'll go hunting. I don't know where I'm hunting, right? This is this sounds crazy, but I'm just like looking around my body and my mind for
Yes.
where I'm holding on to anger.
Yeah.
And sure enough, and now it takes me a while. It takes me a good like a minute or two of trying to like hunt for it. And every time I find something
Yep.
from 5 years ago, 15 years ago,
Yep.
whatever. And it's the exact thing that you, I got goosebumps when you said it, because it's the exact same. I feel it like a knot in my back that is like now gone all of a
Yep.
sudden. And it's like, oh wow, I was holding on for 15 years.
Yeah.
That event, whatever it was, happened, and I've been holding on to it the whole time. And I was laughing when you were saying the thing about your coping skills, because I realized, I was like, I don't think I'm angry. No one that's ever known me has seen me be angry, and yet all throughout my body, somehow I've been able to mask
Yes.
immense amounts of anger, which is why, I mean, that kind of is what I was saying at the very beginning. Like we're all walking around with this unresolved grief.
We are
that-
in so much pain.
Yeah,
As
that-
people, we are in so much pain.
And I feel like that is, there's people that, I think all of us in the room are like people that the reason why we're friends is because I just came kind of realizing this, is that like when I'm around you guys, it's, I realize I'm starting to talk about like, you naturally pull it out of me. And I think there's very few people, I don't think we put ourselves around those people enough where we feel safe and where we can be vulnerable. And that initial, I think there's some sort of subconscious wall that when you're around certain people, it just drops. You don't even realize that it
Nope.
dropped. And all of a sudden you're talking about,
Yeah.
and then you leave and you feel lighter and you feel better. It's because that person somehow got you to bring that wall down.
Well, and that's why when you asked me about the mystery of holding space, I don't know why I have that ability, but I've always had it. And so this awakening for me in this place in my life has been about, then I should use it. I mean, I don't have to understand it to know that it's real. I watch it. I watch it on other people all the time. And also, it's not completely about someone else. It also is healing for me. I said in the beginning, I chose a storytelling collective because we see ourselves in each other. And that has been true for me. There have been profound moments of wisdom and grace and genius in these interviews that have challenged something in me to go, I'm not at the core of that yet. The other thing I thought of too when you were talking,
Yeah.
I think part of the subconscious, so I said we're walking around in a lot of pain. I also think though that there's this, I hear it on repeat with people often, this next thing. There's this fear that if I start crying, I'll never stop, or there is no bottom to my pain, And so I think we're all terrified of that there will never be, it will consume me, whatever my sadness is or my fury. We don't feel that way about joy, strangely enough. We're never like, oh my God, my joy might consume me. We'll take as much of that as we can get.
Yeah.
And so if we were, and I understand that that's because the experience of those things is less pleasant, and we're not wired to.
Your brain is kind of doing its job.
It is.
Yeah.
It's saying, right. But what I have discovered about pain is that the only way out is through, right? We talked about that in the beginning. It will demand to be felt one way or the other.
Yes.
It just does. It demands it.
That has been a central theme of, I feel like, my life for the last 4 or 5 years, is the return of repression.
Yes.
Whatever you try to control the way that it's expressed in your life, and you
Yes.
bury it, it's just going to pop up somewhere else.
Yes.
And you're not going to recognize it.
No,
You're
because
just gonna-
it will have morphed.
Yeah.
They do shape shift.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're furious about something that has nothing to do with what you're actually in pain about, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so many times when I'm picturing conversations with my wife when she's like, "What are you so upset about?" I'm like, "I just am."
Yes.
And I can't figure out why.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's probably, a combination of all these past things that I've just finally started to have enough critical mass to be felt.
Right. And part of it is too, I think, you're giving yourself a different kind of permission to feel it too. I don't even know if those things have gotten critical mass so much as you have started. I've just watched this in you. You've started to go, to do some self-soothing in that and go, I am okay. I'm still safe. That's been huge for me, to tell myself that I can handle my own discomfort. Like, it will not kill me. My own anger or sadness will not kill me.
Yeah. Well, thank you
Yeah,
for coming and talking.
you bet.
Everyone, if you're listening, all the details, links and things like that for Sarah will be in the description. Thank you.
Thanks.
And now it is time for my favorite part of every episode, the poem reading. The name of this poem is In Blackwater Woods by Mary Oliver. Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light. Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich, fragrance, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds. And every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this, the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, let it go. Now is the time of the episode where I offer a concrete, actionable piece of advice or a tool to help us in our grieving process. This episode, the tip is to journal. It is always helpful to journal to help process your life, but I want to talk about a specific type of journaling. So here's what you do. I don't know if you've ever seen these, but go online and just Google emotion wheel. At the center of these emotion wheels, there are 7 primary emotions. So happy, surprised, bad, fearful, angry, disgusted, sad, right? Those are all at the center of the wheel. And as you work your way out, it gets more and more specific. So for example, the next layer down for sad is lonely, vulnerable, despair, guilty, depressed, hurt. And it keeps going more and more specific. And so you print this out and you put it at the front of your journal, and every day, or even multiple times a day, write down how you are feeling. And you can use this emotion wheel to get very specific. You see, this is helpful because for many of us, half of the battle is not even knowing how we feel. Putting a name to how we feel is extremely powerful and extremely helpful. So that is the tip for this episode. Journal and track your emotions. Then you can kind of look back and see, oh, that week I was really angry, or that weekend I felt very isolated. And it can kind of help you train your brain to start to identify these emotions more easily. Okay, that is it for episode 2. In episode 3, we are going to take a look at a letter that Ram Dass wrote to a family that was grieving the loss of their daughter. I think you'll really enjoy it. And again, I'm Brandon Carleton. You can find me on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. The easiest way to find me is probably my website, which is meaningfulagain.com. and the link will be in the description. Feel free to reach out and to message me or to message Steve and comment, on the different posts. Steve also has a closed Facebook group that you can join where we will be discussing each episode. And again, thank you to Steve for letting me sit in for a few episodes. And yeah, we will talk to you in episode 3.